Okay, let me start the lecture. It is my pleasure to have a chance to introduce the state of multiculturalism in South Korea. My name is In-jin Yoon. I'm a professor at Sociology Department and a colleague of Professor Kuocw Kim, who asked me to explain the development and the characteristics of multiculturalism in Korean society. I received my BA degree in sociology in this university, and I went to the University of Chicago to pursue my MA and PhD degrees in sociology. And after I completed my degree in sociology, I taught at the University of California at Santa Barbara before I returned to Korea in 1995. Since then, I started teaching at sociology department. And my research interests include international migration, minorities, and multiculturalism. Okay. Societies go through a number of fundamental changes, such as industrial transition from agricultural society to industrial society, and demographic transition from rapid population growth to population decline and aging. Migration transition follows industrial and demographic transitions. So the first stage is the stage of emigration. So people go out to look for employment opportunities and education and other things. The next stage is the mixed stage of both emigration and immigration. So in this stage, natives go out for employment and education and for other purposes, and at the same time, the same country receive immigrants to their countries. So at the final stage of migration stage, the country becomes the immigrant country that receives immigrants who want to pursue better life at the country of destination. Korea used to be an immigrant-centric country. Korean immigration history goes back to the late 19th century, when Korean farmers, workers, and low-class people went to Manchuria, the northern part of China, and Siberia to cultivate the land. So in the late 19th century, Korea had a very difficult economic times, and Korea also became a Japanese colony in 1910. So under the Japanese rule, many Koreans had to live very difficult lives, so that a growing number of Koreans went to China, Russia, the United States, Mexico, Cuba, and other Latin American countries. In the 1960s, Korea started a group emigration, first to Latin American country, then to West Germany. The main motivation for the Korean government to initiate this kind of group emigration was to relieve population pressure, because at that time Korea experienced rapid population growth. I was born in 1962, and I have 6 siblings, 4 sisters and my younger brother. So the family of 6 children was a norm rather than exception. Nowadays, we have only 1 child or two children. But in the 1960s, we had a baby boom, and the last cohort of the baby boom generation. So, the population size increased more rapidly than the economic growth. So the result of this, imbalance was the high unemployment rate. Especially, Korea, Korean people used to have and still maintain very strong aspirations for education. Nowadays, more than 80% of high school graduates advance to colleges and universities. And that kind of aspiration for education was still strong in the 1960s. So these highly educated people couldn't find job after graduation. So that was a big social problem at the time. So the Korean government that wanted to achieve rapid economic growth wanted to send surplus population overseas. And they also expected remittances sent by these Korean workers abroad to Korea. The foreign currency was strongly needed for the Korean government to secure, financial, capital for economic development. So the Korean government made a contract with the West German government to send Korean miners and nurses, to Germany. And in the 1960s, Germany had their own problems. Since the World War II, West Germany experienced rapid economic growth, and they achieved a high standard of living. So people became more affluent, and they became reluctant to engage in difficult, dirty, and dangerous jobs. So that created labor shortages in construction and mining industry and the manufacturing industries. So the West Germany wanted to import foreign workers who could fill the labor shortages in such industries. So in that context, Korean government wanted to send these Korean workers who could send remittances to Korea, and West Germany wanted foreign workers who provide cheap labor. So the two governments, found a mutual interest. So in this context, thousands Korean miners and nurses went to West Germany in the early 1960s. Okay, that was the beginning of the group emigration in Korean history. Okay, let me show more some images. I went to Korea Immigration History Museum in Incheon last month, and I encourage you to visit this museum. And when I visited the museum in October, they had a special exhibition on Korean miners and nurses who went to West Germany in the early 1960s. Okay, so this photo shows a group of Korean nurses waves goodbyes to their families and friends at the Yeouido airport in the early 1960s. Nowadays, we do not have Yeouido airport. It became the park, but we had this Yeouido airport in the early 1960s. Okay. And these Korean nurses were called in Germany Lotus Bloom. In English, Lotus from the East. So these Korean nurses were praised by the German hospitals for their intelligence and hard working. By contrast, Korean miners had very difficult lives. They worked at very dangerous mines of West Germany, where native Germans were reluctant to work. Okay, so Glück auf was German miners' greeting, meaning good luck, and wishing for safe return from the dangerous underground. So, the Korea had a very difficult, history in the early 1960s. At the time, our economy was not developed, and the people couldn't find work, and the government didn't have resources to provide welfare to people, so that increasing numbers of Koreans went to abroad, to West Germany and Latin America, United States, and in the 1970s to Middle East to work in construction industries. However, situations began to change after the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games. So the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games was a turning point in the history of modern Korea. So after the successful Olympic, Korean economy skyrocketed, and people's standard of living improved significantly. So the Korean people faced the same situation that the West Germans faced in the early 1960s. As the standard of living improved, South Koreans became reluctant to engage in so-called 3D jobs, dirty, dangerous, and difficult jobs. That created labor shortages in manufacturing and construction industries. So in this context, foreign migrant workers, especially from Asia's developing countries, began to enter South Korea in the late 1980s to seek better employment opportunities and higher wages in South Korea. So from the late 1980s, Korea became an immigrant receiving country rather than immigrant sending country. And another group of immigrants began to enter South Korea in the 1980s and in large numbers since 2000s. International marriage began in South Korea in the 1980s by the efforts of Unification Church. Do you know what is Unification Church? It is the religious group led by Pastor Sun Myung-moon. So the Unification Church emphasizes the union and harmony among all people of different race and ethnicity. So it encourages international marriage between people of different nationality and ethnic backgrounds. So the Unification Church began the arranged marriages between Koreans and Asians. That was the beginning of international marriage in modern Korean history. It increased again since 1992 when South Korea opened diplomatic relations with China. Okay? So before 1992, Korea didn't have any formal relations with former socialist countries like China and Soviet Union. But after the collapse of communist countries in the late 1980s, Korea opened its door to China and Russia and the Commonwealth of independent countries. I briefly mentioned the origin of Korean immigration or diaspora that began in the 19th century. So the first group of Korean immigrants went to China and Russia, right? So when South Korea opened its diplomatic relations with China and Russia, there were large numbers of ethnic Koreans in China and Russia already. We had about 2 million ethnic Koreans in China and about 900,000 ethnic Koreans in Central Asian countries and Russia. Okay, so before the diplomatic relations, these ethnic Koreans didn't realize that they had homeland in South Korea. But as a result of these diplomatic ties, these ethnic Koreans began to enter Korea. So the first group of ethnic Koreans who entered South Korea was the ethnic Koreans in China, usually called 조선족. 조선족 people began to enter Korea during the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games. And they sold Oriental medicine in Korea, and that was a huge success. So they made a huge money, and then that started a chain migration. And also the wage gap between Korea and China was very huge and substantial. So if they work in Korea 1 month, then they could earn, a year's salary. So that was a huge incentive for ethnic Koreans to enter Korea. But the Korean government was concerned about the disruption of labor market, as a result of rapid entry of ethnic Koreans to the Korean domestic labor market, so that the Korean government banned the entry of migrant workers to Korea. So the only way that ethnic Koreans could enter Korea was the marriage with Korean men who had difficult times to find their spouses in rural areas because Korean women don't want to spend their life in the countryside. So these old bachelors had a very miserable life, and also their parents wanted to have their grandchildren. So the only way was the arranged marriage between ethnic Korean women in China and Korean men in rural areas. And the local government in the countryside had their own interest in promoting this kind of international marriage because they experienced population decline. Young people, leave the countryside to work in cities. So the population decline, leads to the deductions in their revenue. Okay, so the population size is very important to maintain the economic conditions of the local government. So this local government actually promoted and sponsored this international marriage. So in this context, large numbers of Korean, ethnic Korean women entered South Korea for marriages. And the international marriages increased rapidly in the early 2000s when marriage brokers, started to enter this marriage market, and they, promoted this group, international marriage between Asian women and Korean men. Okay, so as a result of these international marriages, about 11% of all marriages in Korea are international marriages. and the rate of international marriages even higher in the countryside, where about 1/3 of all marriages are international marriages. Okay, so that shows how international marriages are so significant, in Korea and especially in the countryside. Okay. And international marriages produced children of international families. And now we have a growing number of children of multicultural family. Nowadays, about 80% of these children are still at the elementary school level, but within 10 years, then they will become adult and enter the labor market and the mainstream society. And as we may know, these children face a number of problems at both school and home. So many children drop out of school and became less educated, and they will become underclass in Korean society in the future. So at that time, our society will face another significant challenge. So as a result of growing international marriage, Korean society has experienced ethnic transition from ethnically homogeneous society to a society with visible minorities. And then eventually it will become a multi-ethnic society. So I show two contrasting pictures. Korean children of the past, now Korean children of the present. We can see a dramatic increase of diversity. Okay? And this graph shows the trends of registered immigrants in Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. The number of immigrants in Japan began to slow down in the late 2000s. And the trend in Taiwan shows the stabilization of number of immigrants. By contrast, Korea continues to show the increase of immigrants. Okay, this graph shows the number of migrant workers in Japan. And one interesting pattern is the continuing increase of Nikkejin migrant workers. Nikkejin means Japanese descent of Latin America countries. Japan has also long history of immigration. They went to Latin America as agricultural workers, and now they have produced fourth generation. Okay? And when Japanese economy experienced a labor shortage, they began to import these co-ethnics from Latin American countries. The reason for their preference of co-ethnic is that the Japanese government expected that these people might share, the same culture and orientation like Japanese. However, the truth is totally different. These people are not Japanese. They are Peruvians and Brazilians. They couldn't speak Japanese, and their lifestyles and cultures are totally different from the Japanese. So that this Nikkejin, faced the problems of discrimination, alienation, and prejudice in Japanese society. This graph shows the number of migrant workers in Taiwan, and this table shows the stabilization of migrant workers to Taiwan. Okay. By contrast, the number of migrant workers to Korea continue to increase. Okay. So for those reasons, finally, this graph shows the number of international marriages in Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. The three countries show similar patterns of declining, number of international marriages since 2006. Okay. So for that reason, we expect that the international marriages, may not increase rapidly in the future. So their trend will become stabilized in the near future. So then, what are the reasons for the increase of foreigners in South Korea? The first source is the foreign migrant workers. There was fourfold increase in 1995 to 2009. So the official number of migrant workers in South Korea is about 600,000. Okay. That official number includes unregistered migrant workers, or often called illegal workers. But unofficial estimate of migrant workers reaches up to 1 million, okay, because it is very difficult to get an accurate estimate of unregistered migrant workers. Okay. And the second source is marriage immigrants. Okay. As I mentioned, within the past decade, there was a rapid increase of female marriage immigrants from Asia's developing countries. And also, children of multicultural family began to increase as a result of the international marriages. And also, we have a growing number of naturalized Koreans. Okay. And this graph shows the percentage distribution, okay, percentage of distribution of foreigners in Korea in 2009. And I didn't show you the updated graph, but the trend, pattern are the same. Migrant workers account more than half of all foreigners, followed by marriage immigrants and children of international marriages. And more recent trend shows the increasing number of foreign students or international students. Okay, so there seems to be a polarization of immigrants to Korea, maybe to Japan and Taiwan as well. On one hand, we have a group of unskilled workers, okay, and on the other hand, we have a very talented and global, talent like foreign students and highly skilled workers. Okay, so in the past, we didn't have this kind of highly educated and skilled, immigrants, but nowadays the trend shows that the entry of highly educated, professional, and skilled workers will continue to increase. So as a result, the composition of immigrants in our country will become more diverse and more complicated. Okay, so you have a question?
Yeah, I just Googled it. I was just going to ask what naturalization is,
Oh.
but I just Googled it, so
You mean what is naturalization?
Yeah.
Well, naturalization is to become citizens, citizens of South Korea. Okay. Well, naturalization is a very important subject because that may be the barometer of the degree of social inclusion, of a particular country. Countries have different practices and policies of naturalization. Some countries have more inclusive policy to naturalization, and while the other countries maintain quite exclusive policy to naturalization. United States has more open and inclusive policy. Okay, and their policy of naturalization is based on the place of birth. So if a person is born in the United States, regardless of the parents' nationality, then that person will become American citizen. Right? So the children of immigrants will become U.S. citizens. By contrast, Germany, Japan, and Korea keeps the principle of blood. So if you are born outside Korea, between the Korean parents, then you are Korean. By contrast, children of immigrants who are born in Korea cannot become Korean citizens automatically if their parents are not Koreans, right? So naturalization is a very important, the screening device to decide the boundary of society. So if you emphasize the principle of the place of birth, then you can incorporate more people into the boundary of your citizenship. While if you maintain the principle of blood, then you exclude people who are born in their country. So Korea maintains the principle of blood. However, in recent years, it began to incorporate partially the principle of place of birth, right? So it signals that Korean society is responding to changing environment and is responding to the international social norms that emphasize individual human rights. Okay. So if this trend continues in the future, then in 2020, the percentage of foreigners will become 5% of the total population. Okay, so the 5% is it's like the critical mass or watershed that distinguishes multicultural society from non-multicultural society. So if a country has a foreign population that is about 5% of the total population, that we call it a multicultural society. Okay. England, Germany, France has more than 6% of the foreign population. Okay. So as a result of these rapid changes, people began to talk about multiculturalism and multicultural policy since 2000. And growing ethnic and racial diversity has become a challenge to social solidarity based on ethnic and cultural homogeneity. Adaptation problems and human rights issues of ethnic minorities, migrant workers, marriage immigrants, and children of multicultural families became very important social issues. So there was some awareness at the government and the civil society levels that there should be a new principle of social integration out of ethnic and cultural diversity. Okay. So Korean society had initially migrant worker problems. And these workers were accepted to Korea as guest workers. So they were expected to return to their homeland after the expiration of their contract. Okay? So social integration was not a main concern, you know, and these migrant workers suffered from a series of problems like non-payment of their work or delayed payment, physical and sexual harassment, and other forms of violations of their human rights. But at the time, the NGOs that worked for the rights of migrant workers were concerned about the protection of their basic rights rather than, you know, social integration issues. Nowadays, you know, other issues related with social integration became more important, like marriage, family, naturalization, citizenship, education, health and medical service, welfare, community, assimilation, and identity. So when we talk about, you know, integration problem, it includes such a wide ranges of problems. Okay. In the West, multiculturalism was developed to respond to a series of demographic, economic, and social phenomena. For example, low fertility and aging of the population led to the influx of migrant workers who provided, you know, the fresh labor. And in the 1960s, there were increased awareness of rights of minorities as a result of the civil rights movement. And after the Cold War, there was decreased need for the control and the suppression of racial minorities. You know, during the Cold War, each country was concerned about the patriotism of ethnic minorities in their countries. They feared that these ethnic minorities might become espionages of the countries, you know, in the border, you know. But after the Cold War, this fear, you know, disappeared, so that each country in the West could take more inclusive policy toward ethnic minorities. And the widespread consensus and support for free democracy in the West provided a background in which multiculturalism become more prominent. But, you know, but my question is, did South Korea face the same, you know, urgent demographic, social, economic, and political conditions that the West experienced in the 1960s? My answer is no. You know, I said that we have about 3% of foreigner population in our country. That includes temporary, you know, immigrants. So if we just count the number of more permanent immigrants, that figure declined to 1.5%, right? So our country is still not a multicultural society. So although the number of immigrants and foreigners increased, but they are still minorities. You know, ordinary people do not have, you know, frequent opportunity to interact with these minorities. So it is not a you know, urgent issue that South Korea adopted multiculturalism. It seems that Nomu현 government took proactive measures to the changing environment of immigration policy. There were several reasons for the Nomu현 government took proactive measures. The first reason was the reduction of the Korean labor force due to low fertility and aging, so that increased the need for acceptance of immigrants. And the second reason is the competition for global talent. So each Asian countries compete with each other to attract, foreign students and skilled workers, so that the Korean government, actually, loosened the conditions for professional and skilled immigrants to enter Korea. And the third reason was the increase of social cost due to the growth of immigrants and their children, so that the government should take actions to help immigrants to adjust more smoothly in a new environment. And the fourth reason was the international norms emphasizing human rights of migrants. I mentioned that migrant workers in the 1990s suffered from a number of problems, the physical and sexual harassment, and they were not covered by the medical insurance. So even when they're injured, they could not receive medical care. So they had to return to their home country to receive the medical treatment. So that was that was regarded as the national disgrace to the Korean government and the Korean people, that South Korea became the world 11th country in the economic power, but we, provide such a miserable, service and treatment to migrant workers. So that was regarded as the humiliation in the face of the global community. So the Nomu현 and President Nomu현, who was a former, human rights lawyer, had a strong belief in the protection of human rights of minorities. So when he became the president, he ordered the Ministry of Justice to prepare the comprehensive plan for immigration policy. So under his leadership, the Ministry of Justice established several committees, such as the Committee of Foreign Policy, where I am a civilian advisor since its establishment. Okay. So as I briefly mentioned, Korea implemented progressive immigration policy like the employment permit system, the basic rights of foreigners, and Multicultural Family Support Act. So here, the employment permit system is a very significant improvement for migrant workers. The Japanese government started the trainee system in the 1980s. It's like a backdoor policy. For example, the Japanese economy had a labor shortage problem, but the Japanese government was concerned about the permanent settlement of migrant workers. So the one way to solve this dilemma was to admit migrant workers not as regular workers, but as trainees. So these people actually worked the same kinds of, job, while receiving much lower wages because they were trainees, not workers. Right? The problem is Japanese government still maintains this kind of backdoor policy. This policy is often criticized as the disguised form of slavery. Okay. The Korean government actually benchmarked the Japanese system of trainee system. So they initiated the industrial trainee system in the 1992. And under this industrial trainee system, the migrant workers received lower wages while they worked the same kind of job, and they were not allowed to change the workplace. Okay, so in some cases, their passport was kept by the employers to protect the escape of these migrant workers. So as a result of this problem, many migrant workers became unregistered workers. So in the early 1990s and the middle of 1990s, about 60% of migrant workers in Korea were unregistered workers. Okay, so that is a huge mess, of the government policy. And as you may know, Korean society has very strong civil society. It has the history of resistance and struggle for human rights and democracy. In 1961, Park Chung-hee took the power by military coup, and he established the Third Republic in 1962. Okay. So the government started rapid economic development, and in this course of rapid industrialization, he suppressed the labor movements and democracy. And workers had to endure low wages and long working hours and the violation of basic labor rights. So in this context, workers began the labor movements. So as a result, we have a very strong and militant, labor movement. And in the late 1980s, we achieved democratization. Okay, so during this, period of industrialization and democratization, civil society played very significant roles in the development of labor rights and political rights. So as a result, we have a very strong civil society. Okay? And the civil society pushed the government to abolish the former trainee system and adopt more developed system like the employment permit system. So under the employment permit system, migrant workers are treated as regular workers. So they receive the same wages, and they have freedom to choose a workplace 3 times. So for example, if they feel they are mistreated in one workplace, then they can change the workplace for 3 times. Okay? So as a result of employment permit system, the conditions of migrant workers improved significantly. Also, during the Nomu현 government, we established the basic rights of foreigners. So under this law, foreigners receive the same rights and protection as natives. And the Multicultural Family Support Act was designed to provide assistance and support to the female marriage immigrants and their children, such as Korean language education and job training and consulting service. So the basic source of the progressive immigration policy reforms in Korea was a policy alliance between progressive political leaders and civil society. The President Roh Moo-hyun had a more progressive political orientation, and he emphasized human rights. And he regarded civil society as his political supporters. So during his administration, members of civil society participated in the government, and they translated their visions and their goals into concrete policy. So the end result was the establishment of a series of laws like the employment permit system, basic rights of foreigners, and Multicultural Family Support Act. And another reason for this progress in immigration policy reform in Korea was a sympathetic public opinion toward human rights protection and multiculturalism. There are several TV series, program like Asian in Love. So Asian in Love is the program that shows how multicultural family adapts to Korean society and how they overcome their initial difficulties, right? So still at this moment, Korean people maintain somewhat open and tolerant attitudes toward immigrants. I think this kind of sympathetic attitude may not last, in the future, because nowadays we have a growing anti-immigrant sentiment among the natives who feel that they are reversely discriminated by the Korean government's policy that favors immigrants and multicultural family. But still, nowadays, the multiculturalism is regarded a politically correct policy that may overcome the formerly exclusive, narrow, nationalism. So let me compare the Korean situation with the Japanese situation and Taiwanese situation. Japan keeps the backdoor policy, like the training system and the use of Nikkejin as low-skilled workers. Japan does not allow voting rights at local elections for permanent immigrants. During the Kim Dae-jung government, permanent immigrants became eligible to vote in local elections, not in national elections. So that was a significant improvement in the immigrant rights, but Japan does not allow the same voting rights. And in Japan, we have about 900,000 Koreans, Chinese Koreans, and about 40, between 400,000 and 600,000 Koreans are not naturalized Japanese. They still maintain Korean nationality. They are special permanent residents in Japan. And many of them are third generations Okay, so they have been lived in Japan and assimilated to Japanese culture and society. And one only difference is that they do not have Japanese citizenship. So they have demanded their voting rights at local elections, not in national elections. But the Japanese government still, does not allow these voting rights. And multicultural programs in Japan are still local-based and do not have comprehensive and systematic policy at the national level. So Japanese multiculturalism is strong at the local and grassroots level. Okay, they have very vibrant local NGOs and NPOs that help immigrants to adjust in new environment, but they do not have this national level actions. The reasons for passive immigration policy of Japan include the lack of strong political leadership in the parliamentary system. Japanese political system is parliamentary system, where prime ministers are changed so frequently, so that we cannot remember the names of the former prime minister. By contrast, Korea has a presidential system. So we have 5 years of term, and in Korea, presidents have strong political power. I think the problem is the concentration of power in the hands of one person, right? So we'll have a presidential election within a month. Then it's a really important, event in the history of Korea that will determine the future direction of our society. And we have three, candidates who are competing with each other, and the two candidates will decide who will be the runner at the final election. So, what kind of feelings, and ideas you have, especially from the outsider's point of view? Maybe Koreans are so used to this kind of situation, but from outsiders' point of view, it may look bizarre and very, exceptional. For example, we have a candidate from the ruling party, 새누리당, Park Geun-hye, who has been the candidate for several months. But who is the candidate from the opposition party? That will be decided maybe in 1 week, right? Maybe less than 1 week, because they promised. But can you see this kind of phenomenon in other countries, that the final candidates are still not decided, right? And these two candidates from the opposition parties have to decide the rules to decide the single candidate. They have to decide it in a matter of time. Okay, so from the foreigner's viewpoint, it may look very unusual, right? Very unusual. But from Koreans' viewpoint, it is quite normal, and I do not say it's natural, but it is quite common. And Koreans are used to this kind of very unusual and very rapid, decision-making process, because our country has experienced so many, events, so many dramatic events and accidents. successively, we experience a series of wars and political upheavals. For example, the Japanese colonialism from 1910 to 1945, and immediately after the liberation, we had a Korean War from 1950 to 1953, right? And then we had a political coup in 1961, and we had a series of military regimes from 1960s to 1980s, and we achieved democratization in 1980s. So many changes. So in this context, Koreans could not prepare long-term plans. We couldn't have enough time to prepare long-term goals, because we could not predict what will happen in the future. So naturally, Koreans developed some kind of habit of responding to situations in a matter of time. We call 임기응변 in Korean. In English, it's a quick response, to rapid changes. So for Koreans, 1 week is enough time, or 1 month is enough time to figure out, the solutions. We can look at these things from different angles. Japanese people may criticize this as the lack of preparation, hectic response. But from the other angle, it may show the dynamic, dynamic response to, uncertain future. And in Koreans' mind and blood, I think, Koreans have developed this kind of DNA that respond to, unpredictable futures by their rapid responses. So I want to see a more bright picture of this kind of situations. So these whole situations show that anyhow Koreans are trying to respond to changes, right? So these three candidates promise substantial and significant reforms, not only in the political sphere, but also in social and economic reforms. But, they make a promise, and when they become president, they may not keep the promise, but still, important thing is our society is responding to changing environment in more dynamic way. Okay, so I see some potential in the growth of our society. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that in the presidential system in Korea, where presidents has strong leadership, and when he believes in certain things, like the protection of human rights, then he can change the system to develop laws and policies and programs to realize that goal. Okay? By contrast, in the parliamentary system, where prime ministers and professional political leaders do not have strong political leadership, and by contrast, bureaucrats have strong influence in the government, then it is very difficult to make changes and go beyond conventional practice. So I see that kind of, passive response in the Japanese case. And also, in contrast to strong and vibrant civil society in South Korea, the Japanese civil society is local-based and weak, and they do not have policy alliance with the government. Moreover, there is strong resistance of the general public to accept migrants as members of Japanese society. So nowadays we see a growing, conservatism in Japanese society, and the ultra right-wing political leaders openly make speeches and announcements that attack neighboring countries. They do not apologize for their past wrongdoings. And the Japanese public are very passive to this kind of reversal of liberal democracy in Japanese society. So I see very contrasting images in Japan and Korea. Although Korea is still in the middle of rapid changes, and we still have chaos and confrontations in every sector of society, but somehow we are trying to make changes and reforms, and a strong government and strong civil society, when they make some kind of alliance, then they can create a significant synergy that can lead to significant reforms in immigration policy. And I cannot see the same kind of potential in Japanese society. Okay. And Taiwan's case is somewhat different. The problems of immigrants was the initial source of the multiculturalism policy in Japan and Korea, but Taiwan had the problem of indigenous people from the beginning. Okay, the Taiwan consists of several groups: the indigenous people, and early arrivals and late arrivals after the 1948. So now the majority group is late arrivals who conquered the indigenous people and early arrivals. But the indigenous people began to start their movement for recovering land in 1988, and the movement of Hakka people for the restoration of their original name and language. Hakka is the tribe in China who has been well known for overseas travel and commerce. So Hakka people has achieved the global network of international commerce. Okay, so everywhere these Hakka people has their tribal associations, but in Taiwan they were forbidden to speak their original language and the names. But in the 1960s, they began the movement for recovering of their original name and language. And the Protestant churches participated in the advocacy movement for these indigenous people and Hakka people. And in 2000, the Democratic Progressive Party, led by Chen Shui-bian, adopted the multicultural policy as the national policy. Okay? The Democratic Progressive Party, which has strong emphasis on the independence of Taiwan, forged alliance with multiculturalism. So President Chen Shui-bian adopted multicultural policy as a way of integrating diverse groups and competing social groups. So like in Korea, in Taiwan, there was a
policy alliance, between the government and the civil society. So the civil society in Taiwan played very significant roles to protect and advance rights of indigenous people and marriage immigrants. Okay. TASAT is a advocacy group that work for the protection of female marriage immigrants. And they developed the international network in Asia to launch the collaborative efforts. So, when we compare Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, there was early convergence in immigration policy due to urgent economic interest and the lack of experience. So there was a benchmarking effect. So Korea adopted the Japanese training system. When they didn't have any previous policy to handle foreign migrant workers. And also Korea followed the Japanese practice of favoring co-ethnics. In Korea, co-ethnics from China and Russia can enter Korea freely for 5 years. And they can work in many sectors of industry, while non-Korean migrant workers have a very limited choice in their employment. So in that sense, co-ethnics receive preferential treatment from the Korean government. That is the same pattern in Korea and Japan. However, in 2000s, there was divergence in immigration policy among the three countries. And the main reason for that is the human rights issues and influence of civil society. In Taiwan and Korea, civil society pushed the government to make reforms in immigration policy and to adopt more inclusive policy to help immigrants adjust more smoothly in new environment, whereas Japanese society remained passive. Okay? So there was a divergence in immigration policy in 2000s. So what will be the future? Will there be convergence? For example, Japanese government will adopt more inclusive policy toward immigrants so that the three countries will become similar in immigration and foreign policy, possibly due to global standards, democratization, and multiculturalization. So that will be the question that we have to keep our eye on it. So that is the main ideas of my lecture. So in a very short period of time, I covered not only Korea but also Japan and Taiwan. But this kind of a comparative look will help you understand better the state of multiculturalism and how each country responds to similar conditions in different ways. Then what are the reasons for these different strategies? So that are the main issues that sociologists may find it interesting and find it worthwhile to pursue their academic inquiry. Okay, so I will receive questions. Yeah. 이걸로. Okay.
I was wondering if I now decided that I like being in Korea so much that I want to stay here and want to finish my studies here, maybe then later want to work here, and I want to be a Korean citizen in the end. What would I have to do?
Okay, in that case, I think you have good prospect, because the Korean government, favors, immigrants of high education and talent. So they have a special policy that is geared to that group, that kind of people. So when you finish your study, then and if you find the work, then you can apply for permanent residence. And the Korean government is now moving towards the permanent residence system as a pre-step toward naturalization. Okay? So like in the United States, you should become permanent residents for 5 consecutive years before you apply for citizenship. Right? So Korea is now following the same procedure. So it wants to open more doors to permanent residents. And these permanent residents will have basically the same rights as native Koreans, in exception of political rights. But other than political participation in everyday social and economic life, permanent residents will have the same rights and privileges. So the Korea is moving toward that direction. So, and the Korean government will, favor people of higher education and skills, so that I think you can get permanent residence relatively, more easily in the future. Then, when you keep your permanent residence for a certain period of time, then you can apply for citizenship. So for those people, I think the future will be more promising and bright. But for people of unskilled workers, I think they will, maintain the, a very, gloomy, future. So I think the opportunities will be more open in the future. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So, what is your major?
Political science.
Political science.
Not
I
so
don't know.
promising, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know whether especially in engineering and natural science and life science, because in those fields, native Koreans are reluctant to work in engineering, natural science, so that these departments have problems of recruiting graduate students, right? So they are now accepting, foreign students from developing countries, and these people will get, the permanent residence and citizenship more easily. But in political science, I don't know about the job prospect, but one thing is quite clear, that our society is moving toward more globalization. The university is one example. Although all universities in Korea emphasize globalization, the way they make their effort is to accept more foreign students, but very passive in accepting foreign scholars, the professors. But in the near future, maybe within a decade, I think there will be more opportunities for foreign scholars to find jobs in research institute and colleges and universities. Right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
In your opinion, what do you think will come first, the change of attitudes or the change of policy in terms of multiculturalism?
That is a good question. My opinion is that we can make changes in the system, like laws and the policy, relatively more easily. But I think that is the precondition of multiculturalism. So, for example, anti-discrimination law is the basic, basic condition, for a multicultural society. But anti-discrimination law cannot change people's minds and attitudes. It'll take more time and effort to change people's attitudes and mind, but still anti-discrimination is necessary because it discourages, wrongful actions toward people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So in their minds, still they keep prejudice and stereotypes, but they cannot express their prejudice and discrimination to foreigners. So it has a discouraging effect, right? So for that reason, I think we needed to have the kind of policy and law. And at the same time, we have to strengthen, multicultural education from very beginning, early, from the early period of individuals. Even at the kindergarten and at the family, that we needed to teach our children and students that diversity is asset, rather than problem. So if we have a greater diversity, then we'll have a greater option. That this ethnic and cultural diversity will become the future engine of our society, right? For example, I have studied overseas Koreans for 2 decades, and I used to be the president of the Association for Overseas Koreans, and now I'm the president of the North Korean Migrants Studies. So, overseas Koreans have been my key research area. So let me explain the experience of overseas Koreans and how their experience can be a good lesson for Korea. For example, in the United States, we have about 2 million Koreans, and they are called Korean Americans. So these Korean Americans now they actually live in transnational environment. In the past, when they live, let me show you the earlier picture. If you look at this picture, that at the time, living for other country was regarded as how can I say, unpredictable departure from the homeland and from your family. Okay, so So immigration or international migration at the time was regarded as a one-way movement, from developing country to a developed country. And in the, country of destination, immigrants were expected and obliged to assimilate to the host society's culture, right? But nowadays, we live in a transnational space. For example, Korean Americans watch Korean TVs and programs and listen to K-pops, and they travel frequently. So they actually live in two countries at the same time. So in the 1960s, people who emigrated to the United States was often called betrayers of country, who abandoned country, who suffered from economic difficulties, and who were selfish migrants in search of better opportunities. But nowadays, these people are really important human capital, not only for the United States, but also for South Korea, right? So, Korean Americans who are about 2 million in the United States are really important asset, not only for Korea, but also for the United States, right? So, in that sense, immigrants and their descendants in our country can play the same role. For example, children of Vietnamese mother and Korean father can become a bridge between Vietnam and Korea, So in that sense, I think it is very important for Korean that this kind of cultural diversity can strengthen its national resources and capacity. So that is one goal that multicultural education should pursue and persuade Koreans to change their nationalistic ideas toward more universal and cosmopolitan ideas. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Let me receive the final question. Oh, okay. Can I get your question at Hudan University? Do you have any questions? Okay. So because we didn't have a break, so let me finish here. And I wish you have a good time, and I want you to take advantage of my lecture in your future ideas and career. Okay, thank you.